Hello everyone, so today we talk about that very important and relatively um, neglected series of events that in European history went from the rule of Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor, to the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. So this period that lays between the end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century was marked by political events that deeply influenced a great part of European history, of the Middle Ages, but also of following events. And the let's go to actually look at them in depth. Obviously, we can't discuss everything in detail, but at least we can enucleate them and observe them one by one. So the most important turning point, probably, of these events was the Swabian succession of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI to the Norman throne of Sicily. That was one of the most powerful kingdoms at the time. Following the death, without at least direct heirs, of secular Norman king William the Second. So Henry VI managed to be crowned Sicilian king by marrying the legitimate heiress of the Hauteville dynasty. That was Constance, as you want to call her, and a marriage that would have in itself already extremely important consequences in the history of medieval Europe, if anything, because it generated the future Emperor Frederick II. But relatively to Henry VI, we have to say first of all that the rise to first of all, his rise to the throne was definitely very was obstacled. There was a very fierce resistance against him. First of all, because in Germany the let's say, Swabian party was always there. It had strengthened after the defeat of Lignano that Henry's father had suffered against the Lombard League, and because of all the enmities that always existed into the German aristocracies, within German aristocracies, and the Henry VI, however, met a very substantial resistance also in his Sicilian domains as well. Substantially, the anti-imperial party counterposed to Henry the natural son of a brother of William II, whose name was Tancred, Count of Lecce. Lecce is an Apulian city, and Apulia was within the Kingdom of Sicily, together with Sicily, the most important land, the wealthiest land, the most fertile one. In fact, eventually Frederick II was called the son of Apulia, and he was probably more attached even to Apulia than Sicily itself, where he had been raised. And the rebellion of the Apulian barons was a very serious thing in this sense, because they had a consistent amount of resources to put into use against the Sicilian king. So and by the way, this Norman nobility, essentially secular Norman nobility, at least when we say Sicilian now, we don't mean really Sicily only. We're talking about the world domains of the kingdom. So also in southern and central Italy. And let's say that in all these dominions, the Norman nobility naturally was pretty rooted, and pretty well rooted, and and there was evidently a opposition to what was in practice a foreign domination. sometimes, including me, I mean, I have a lot of sympathies for the Swabians, subjectively, as a non-historian. Let's say when I become a historian, I generally tend to be more neutral into this, like I'm doing now, in fact. But we have to think that, and of the, let's say, parabola of the Swabians as these universal rulers and all. But indeed, the Swabians at this point for the Sicilian kingdom were foreigners in practice. Actually, Sicily was not even part of the Holy Roman Empire proper, although the thing was complicated by the fact that the Sicilian kings were formerly vassals of the Roman Pope. So this was a very important bond that even fueled eventually the part of the resistance against the Swabians, as we will see now. And therefore you have to think of the Norman nobility not wishing really to give up to these German newcomers, and being still quite jealous of their kingdom that had basically extinguished just because of dynastic reasons, and wasn't extremely it hadn't fallen as a consistent as a power in itself. Excuse me, I drink a little. So Tancred at this point was even managed even to be crowned at Palermo in 1190, and he managed to obtain even international aid against Henry, and getting the support of the English king Richard Lionheart, and even the one of the popes, Clement III, who ruled from 1188 to 1191, and Celestine III, who ruled afterwards from 1191 to 1198. So this was a very important help. If anything, because, well, you think, well, did the English have to do with the Sicilians at this point? Well, actually a lot, aside the fact that they had this common Norman origin as kingdoms, but most importantly in the international politics at the time, the English were backing the wealth powers, the power of the you can say either the Welfen or the Guelphs, depending on how you know from which the Welfen were the anti-Swabian dynasty practically, and Guelph is the Italianization that was used in central and northern Italy by the Italian communes to define basically those who supported the Pope, and in this sense in an anti-imperial fashion. So the English at this time were allied with the Saxons. The Saxons were some of the major opponents of the Swabians at this time. Saxony and England had strong even economic ties, even dynastic ties. There was marriage. There were marriages between the English royals, the English royalty, and the Saxon dukes. Even at this time, we will see that Otto of Brunswick was the son of an English princess, and of his father Henry the Lion, who had been the fiercest opponent of Henry's father Frederick I of Barbarossa. So placing, I mean, for the English monarchs, supporting a essentially a Sicilian rebel against the Swabian rule into Sicily was definitely a very profitable international um, mm, goal. Also because the Swabians at this time were starting to be close to the King of France, that was obviously enemy with the English. I'd say naturally enemy with the English this time, and therefore really all European politics was done in this way. Never think that the Middle Ages was a bunch of isolated kingdoms where nobody traveled and where they were all concerned about their own tiny things. International politics was always extremely developed during the Middle Ages, and there were really these strategic targets that now we are even simplifying, because there were huge implications of these sightings, even with the Holy Land, the Crusader states in the Near East, also with the Byzantine Empire that was prominently involved into these matters, even the Spanish kings. I mean, it was really all very complicated. So now we're just even simplifying. And relatively to the papal support to the enemies of the Hohenstaufen, um, obviously that was quite important, because the quite of a big worry for the Swabians, because the popes could use very powerful weapons, including the ideological ones against the emperors. And however, Tancred um, you have to understand also the popes, by the way. I wanted to finish this point, relatively to the fact that, why were the popes really opposing instead. We've seen the English, why the popes did oppose the Hohenstaufen at this point. Well, simply because what they wanted to do was to unify the Kingdom of Germany with the one of Sicily. The Kingdom of Germany wasn't unified, as we've seen. It was divided between the German princes. The Swabians, after the defeat of Legnano and the death of Frederick Barbarossa in the Third Crusade, were still a very consistent power to be reckoned with in Germany. And adding to their domains, the Kingdom of Sicily was definitely a very dangerous thing for the Pope, that was essentially struggling to carve its own dominion into central Italy. And basically, you have to think that northern Italy at this time was essentially split between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. So there was a consistent part of central and northern Italians that were siding with the emperor, in this sense against the Pope, or more or less, because even the various Italian city-states were pursuing their own very sneaky policies, like anyone else, by the way, at this time. But in the sense that they were not really keen. They were not really keen neither on nor of the emperor nor of the Pope. But you understand pretty clearly, looking at the map of Europe, that the between Germany and northern Italy and central Italy, and excuse me, in southern Italy, papal states were essentially put into a grip that could be very dangerous for them. What the major goal of the Holy Roman Emperors was practically to control the papacy, to elect the popes, and to make them legitimize their own the emperors, not just through their material power, but also with with a sort of spiritual investiture. And instead, the popes were using their power essentially to aggrandize themselves, and trying to diminish the imperial authority that was really still big at this time, and that with the union of the Kingdom of Sicily was going to be revived into a very um, um, very powerful regional scale um, empire, substantially. But eventually, the rebel Tancred died in 1194, so Henry could finally seize the Kingdom of Sicily without any other consistent opposition. And this caused, obviously, however, this didn't make die out the resistance in other dominions of the empire. And in the same years, Henry had to deal, in fact, in Germany with the revolt of the Duke of Saxony, Henry the Lion, that we mentioned before, and of his son, Otto of Brunswick, that had to eventually success his father as Duke of Saxony. That, as we were saying before, were backed by Richard of England. However, the problem was that at a certain point, Richard, as it's widely known, coming back from the Third Crusade, was imprisoned by the Austrian Duke Leopold, if I'm not wrong, because of certain attrition that had existed between the Austrian Duke and the English King during the Third Crusade itself. If I'm not wrong, Richard had quarreled with Leopold and had substantially thrown the Austrian insignia into a sewer into Ascalon, I think, or I don't know where else, but I mean it was a pretty insulting thing that Leopold never forgot. And when Richard was coming back home from the Crusades through the European land route through Central Europe, he got captured into Austria. He was recognized, if I'm not wrong, there is all a story about this from his reign, and he was imprisoned in a tower and kept as a sort of credit card, let's say, for all the European sovereigns that basically took him into custody in turn, and asking a ransom for him to come back into England. And it doesn't happen really every day to capture the Kingdom of England and being able to dispose of him at will. So the Henry VI, I mean, the Austrian Duke was definitely vassal of Henry VI, as considering that Henry was the emperor and Leopold a German prince. So Henry basically freed Richard, only having received his feudal homage and having paid a very heavy ransom. So this was disastrous, by the way, also for the English kingdom in economical terms, and definitely strengthened Henry consistently. So Henry, in this sense, was managing really to win over his antagonists. Um, let's say the empire that he ruled was definitely expanded, both in strengths and on the geographical scale dimension, let's say. But at the same time there were some repercussions, because you have to think that this time uh, every the fragmentation of Europe was such for which as soon as as soon as someone rose to the top and became too powerful, all the other states, in spite of their enmities and rivalries, um, uh, basically joined together in trying to diminish his power. Another problem was definitely also the, uh, the the differences that existed between the dominions that he had. I mean, Germany and Sicily were two very different lands. They weren't even contiguous in geographically, so there were also communication problems. There was the papacy in the middle, so there were strategic problems that were quite evident at this point. So definitely the papacy was pushing insistently and to break his the unity of his domains, um, and and Henry couldn't even do too much against the Pope at this point, because he would have been conceived as, even as a tyrant in some measure, and there could be other powers that could eventually that could intervene in favor of the papacy in this sense. um, the excommunication was a very risky thing to take on the imperial crown, because that basically solved all the vassals, the imperial vassals, from the fealty towards the sovereign. Um, so Harry was, however, continuing in his mm, dynastic intent of building a universal monarchy. In this sense, he had received the vassalage of the Kingdom of England, also of the Polish. Also having collected the Hauteville legacy was not a you know from an ideological point of view, a small thing at all, because the Hauteville, especially in their for their ties with the papacy, were conceived as kind of favored. I mean, the Kingdom of Sicily was considered this kind of very happy and favored um, um, land of, I can't say of Christianity, because actually the rest of Europeans always looked at the secular Normans with kind of suspicion, because basically these Normans had mixed in there with the local, with different traditions, even with different religions. So there was all propaganda and prejudices and stereotypes that considered the Southern Normans as sort of bastards of Poulain in French. But at the same time, there was the might of the Kingdom of Sicily that really strengthened the Hohenstaufen prestige at this point internationally. I mean, the Hauteville had the Kingdom of Sicily was the gateway for the Byzantine Empire, for the Near East. It was an extremely wealthy land, although uh, all these wars of succession weren't being really a great help for the economical health of the kingdom. But let's say that things were decently kept still. standing at this point. So um, it was, however, the Kingdom of Sicily was really the base for building a Mediterranean empire, which was, by the way, what the Hohenstaufen were mainly interested in. The Hohenstaufen uh, basically put all their forts outside of Germany. I mean, there is this idea that if the Hohenstaufen had concentrated all their strength, all the armies that they sent against the Italians, for instance, into the German rivals, they might have achieved actually a German national monarchy, just like England and France. But evidently, the Mediterranean perspective was the most convenient of all, in the sense, in economical terms, in strategical terms, and building the Roman Empire couldn't happen but from Italy at this point as well. There was also a very important ideological reason for this. I mean, the papacy was set in Rome. Rome was the symbol of the Roman and Christian Empire. So this kind of even morbid fascination of the Swabians with Italy was definitely dictated by very pragmatic reasons, because seizing power into Italy equated to own such a huge quantity of resources that could have very easily allowed them to build up, to represent the Roman Empire. And you have to think that this was not just in the West, it was also in the East, because Henry VI came also pretty close to conquer Constantinople. And Constantinople, by the way, would have fallen into the French and Venetian hands just 7 years after the death of Henry. So it was really a feasible thing. If Henry had lived on, he might have achieved that. I mean, reuniting the western and eastern halves of the empire, and therefore reaching the, uh, the greatest peak ever touched by the Holy Roman emperors. And not just in terms of sheer material power, but also and especially from an ideological point of view, because you have to think that at this time everything that happened, politically speaking, militarily speaking, was justified on the light of divine will. So if the Hohenstaufen had managed to become the sole emperors of Christianity, that would have been an evident um, um, proof the divine of the divine will and of the sanctity of the Hohenstaufen dynasty in this perspective. But Henry VI died unexpectedly, or at least suddenly, in 1197. He had practically barely 32, he was 32 years old at the time, so also a very young sovereign. He could have achieved much more if he had lived just as, I don't know, his father, that in spite of the fact that he died of an accident of unnatural causes, had been living for a very long time. The Hohenstaufen were probably, they had pretty solid skins in this sense, but at that time, even if you were strong and fit, you could die pretty easily of a very simple illness. Um, Life was quite miserable at that time. Didn't really matter whether you were Holy Roman Emperor or the last of the serfs. And this was also and even a death like this was conceived in, in kind of was framed from the people of the time into a sort of divine will that evidently had not wished Henry to rule. So that in turn translated itself into a proof somehow that, or at least for whom wanted to use it in this fashion at least, that Henry's death was sort of divine punishment for the Hohenstaufen dynasty that in this sense was not meant to rule. Um, and by the way, Frederick the second was already born. However, his mother Constance died actually 1 year after her husband, and leaving the young Frederick that was only 4 years old at the time, if I'm not wrong, in a very uncertain with a very uncertain destiny, because being the heir of such a huge domain with so many enemies, and being a minor that is not just like, I don't know, 12 that maybe in 4 years can be crowned, but being just like 4, so just a baby or something more. Um, uh, it was very, very risky, but as we will see now, there were also supporters of this Swabian cause, and a certain political upheavals that really eventually favored and saved Frederick's future. Um, and the great move actually that was done by Constance of Hauteville, that is very meaningful for a mother as well, was to entrust, I mean, his son to the tutelage of the Pope Innocent III. Incidentally, I made a video about Innocent III a few days ago, so if you want to check that out, it doesn't specifically talk about this in detail, but it just gives a dimension about what the papacy, how the papacy was dwelling, and what this pontiff actually managed to achieve. The papacy, with the crisis of the new crisis of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, was in turn expanding very consistently. So Constance understood quite clearly that once that Henry had died, in spite of her being still alive, unfortunately just for a very few time still, her son was in very deep trouble, for the aforementioned reasons, and therefore she entrusted him to the Pope. And this was very important because who objectively could touch an adoptive son of the Pope. By the way, Frederick was still meant to be the for feudal law, by feudal rights, the heir of the Sicilian kingdom at least, and of the Swabian domains, but not of the Holy Roman Empire, because at that point a new emperor had to be elected, because the German crown was elective, so you didn't inherit the German kingdom of the Holy Roman Empire if your father was had owned them. So the young Frederick in this sense was used as a political pawn to counterbalance eventually, as we will see, the new political um, um, scenario, the new political situation. And as we were saying, there was a special bond between the Kingdom of Sicily and the papacy, as in relation vassal and master practically. So the idea of Innocent III was to transform Frederick in the perfect pupil of the Church, in order to have in the future a loyal, a faithful Sicilian ruler. Then eventually also as a Holy Roman Emperor, because now, as we will see, the papacy eventually changed alliance, actually in favor of the Swabians, because we will see it now. So there was this grand project, let's say, of making Frederick the greatest ruler of Europe, but at the same time the perfect, um, um, but at the same time to make him perfectly obedient to the church, by Innocent. Um, the So in 1208, by the way, Frederick, now um, mm, enough old enough, was formally granted the title of Sicilian king, mm, by by the Pope as well. However, going a step back, the premature death of Henry II had reopened the succession games, the games of the succession to the empire. And a very important role was played in the sense by the Pope, that initially backed Otto of Brunswick, so basically the Welfen house, um, opposed to the Swabians, and Otto was at this time actively contending the imperial crown to the last of the five sons of Frederick Barbarossa, that was Philip of Swabia. Philip of Swabia was the brother of Henry VI, hence uncle of the young Frederick. Um, but eventually Otto won, and he was crowned emperor in 1209. By the way, Otto had Philip assassinated, which was something very perceived as very wrong to do. I mean, those times were very violent, but managing to solve a matter through assassination was considered an act of cowardice. I mean, the idea is that if you had the proper right to rule, there was no need to recur to such brutal means. Also, in Christian terms, it was considered very infamous. So Otto was a pretty um, a ruthless ruler, and once he managed to rise to the throne through the promise of not reuniting uh, um, mm, um, the German domains with the Sicilian ones, because this was also a concern of the papacy, that Otto could at this point overthrow the young Frederick from Sicily, because objectively this is what was achieved in some measure. He Because there were, by the way, you have to think that at this time the Kingdom of Sicily was still practically ruled by the German nobility, German nobility that had settled into Sicily, and through the German net of of relations, definitely Otto could play on the Germans that were settled into Sicily, and that had taken, were invested as local nobles by since the time of Henry VI, to control even the Sicilian kingdom. And the papacy had granted Otto the crown with the explicit promise, obtaining the explicit promise of not reuniting the two powers. And instead, the first thing that Otto did as soon as he rose to power basically was to expand his control over southern Italy, as well as in Germany, and progressing in Germany at least. Um, So the idea was that there was also another problem relatively to this, because the papacy owned, um, the papacy was expanding to these central Italian lands that historically belonged to the Church of Rome, according to what the popes claimed, at least, but that were formally part of the Holy Roman Empire. Let's say that the empire had not been strong enough for most of its existence to claim such a peripheral um, area of the empire like central Italy. That was also a pretty difficult land to expand in. The same papacy actually struggled for this, because the Pope practically controlled only the region around Rome. Even crossing the Apennines was pretty difficult feat. It was all the Adriatic domains that were still, let's say, even more distant and especially adverse to papal expansion, were a lot of city-states and lordships that locally went against the papal expansion. And theoretically, those lands, however, did belong to the empire by right. And yet, first of all, as we've seen, that there were frontier lands, so the emperors chiefly chiefly ruling from Germany, were and not even in there they having a very strong rule, were didn't essentially care to claim back territories into which the papacy was expanding, because the papacy, from their point of view, could still back their powers, legitimate their elections, so they didn't care to make the Pope their enemies most of the times, in spite of all the struggle with investitures and all the problems that occurred. And now Otto, however, was claiming back his sovereignty over the imperial sovereignty, actually, over the central Italian territories that Innocent intended to claim firmly back under the ecclesiastical authority. And this was evidently a big problem, because Otto was doing exactly what the Swabians had been doing in terms of reunion of the empire, and in pursuit of the universalistic ambitions. So the papacy at that point excommunicated Otto as a with the by the way, with a very harsh accusation of being a perjurer, a liar, because he had objectively deceived the papacy by breaking the promise that he had solemnly sworn of, and that was a very important thing, politically speaking, because it could be seen, I mean, oaths were very important at this time. They had a very solid public meaning, reconnaissance. I mean, there were they had a value of contract, essentially. So breaking that contract was illegal, as in any other situation. And this excommunication took place in 1210. So at this point, the Pope saw in the young Sicilian king Frederick II the most adequate candidate to the imperial throne, because you know that once that the emperor is excommunicated, it automatically means that someone else has to rise to the throne. You cannot excommunicate, I mean, you cannot remain on the throne if you are excommunicated, or at least you can try to do that, but you're not being recognized as emperor. your vassals, and the vassals in turn have the moral right as Christians to and even the legal right by law in practice, by earthly law, to overthrow you. um, and before it's kind of funny that before actually backing Frederick as new candidate for the empire, the Pope made him swear the same exact promise of not reuniting the crowns of Sicily and of Germany uh, uh, once again, which was something. You might say, well, but how this did happen if he was about to rise to the German throne and he was Sicilian king? Well, yeah, the idea was not to definitely increase its power to aggrandize himself at the point of interfering with papal policy and claiming back the imperial prerogatives over the um, nomination of popes, and also uh, really all the same problems that recurred over and over again since the time of the struggles for investitures, that even if they had been won by the church, but up to a certain point the thing could be still be reversed, uh, really on the base of this um, political dynamics. Uh, the the and the situation was really was very delicate because not even the papal support at this point could be enough to stop actively Otto of Brunswick um, power, because he had objectively risen to a very high condition of force, let's say. And it was here that the French enter actively into the game, or well, better it's the other way around, because basically the Saxons and the English invaded France, and it was at the time actively supporting both the papacy and and Frederick II, because they evidently feared the Anglo-Saxon alliance. Anglo-Saxon, I mean it in the sense of the English kingdom and the Saxon and the Welfen, let's say, not the Anglo-Saxon like the old people. But I guess that this explanation is superfluous. And it was really the greatest battle of the Middle Ages that solved the matter. On July the 27th, 1214, at Bouvines in Flanders, um, the armies of Otto of Brunswick and of John Lackland of England, that had succeeded to his brother Richard the Lionheart, um, and French vassals, and the French king, actually Philip II Augustus of France, from the other side, clashed in two would would be actually as I was saying before, the most important battle of the Middle Ages. The Battle of Bouvines wasn't really a huge battle. I mean, there were battles that were fought all over Europe that were much larger than that. The Battle of Bouvines was largely a cavalry battle. And there was also Flemish infantry that resisted till the very end on the Anglo-Saxon side, Anglo-German, say better, Anglo-German side. But it was really it was a relatively contained battle in numbers. Not a small battle at all, but definitely a battle that is more important for its political consequences than its military value in itself, let's say, its tactical importance. This is what I meant. Um, because it really changed the whole European history. Mm. The Anglo-Germans got defeated by the French very harshly. At that time, winning a battle where, you know, hundreds of thousands of knights participated to equated to basically wipe out the resources of the defeated domains for a generation in practice. You couldn't really field once again in a very short time the resources that you had lost in a battle, because economy had its growth rates that were quite slow. The Battle of Bouvines and the French victory sanctioned actually first of all the rise of France as major power in Europe, and together with France actually the triumph of feudalism um, as socio-political system practically into the 13th century. In England, it threw England into chaos, and from this chaos, however, originated the Magna Carta that had the huge consequence, the huge influence that we all know. In this sense, it would have been very interesting to see how the English monarchy would have actually developed in English history and world history in turn, if the English had won at Bouvines together with the Germans, because probably the English kingdom would have come out enormously, the English monarchy especially would have come out enormously strengthened by a victory, and maybe, I don't know, the Magna Carta would have not existed, maybe the English Civil War, English Civil War, a bit too late in time, so there were lots of other events, even during the same Middle Ages, that might have not occurred, a complete different history. However, in Germany, definitely the defeat of Otto equated to the rise of the Swabians, and that with Frederick II saw a new phase of glory and might of power. Frederick II, in this sense, as a Holy Roman Emperor, was grown to be known as the Stupor Mundi, as the marvel of the world. He was arguably the greatest, at least in ideological terms, the greatest sovereign of the Middle Ages, in the European Middle Ages at least. Think at all the myth that has been built around the figure of Frederick. Frederick is an historical figure that has yet to be well studied. Really, there are since his times there have been too many ideological interpretations of his figure, and every time we go researching on Frederick, there's always something new that comes out. Frederick was a huge mind. He had an excruciatingly important impact on European culture, and we all know, in this sense. I made a few videos about Frederick. Maybe you can go check those out. I talk about Frederick as a man of science, for instance. I'm gonna tell you how many videos I made. I think only one. Let me check. Yes, I made two videos. Frederick II of Hohenstaufen as man of science, and the ideological struggle between the papacy and Frederick of Hohenstaufen. So, yeah, two videos. I shall make more about him. So the this was mostly a Holy Roman Imperial history video, and we can conclude by saying that Frederick eventually was crowned as King of Germany in 1212, and this paved him the way for the imperial title, as we were saying. I'll stop here for today. I see that the video is it's shorter than I expected. I hope that you enjoyed it. We will definitely come a lot again on these topics, on Frederick especially, but also on Henry VI, on the Anglo-German relations that I think are important. And I just hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you want to receive further news about my contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.